you're young or old, you can't help but recognise that music from the adventures of Robin Hood. In fact, my guest tonight wouldn't automatically associate himself with the famous archer. An author of many books on the Highgate vampire, he has gained a reputation as vampire hunter, a title I know he would rather us not use tonight. He's more of a psychic investigator than a historian. I am of course referring to David Farrand. Welcome, David.
Good evening, Drew.
Now, I'm sure the viewers out there would like to know your take on all this regarding the Robin Hood's grave. First of all, do you actually believe that is the grave in Yorkshire of Robin Hood?
It's a very difficult question. I've always been unsure about it being his actual grave, meaning quite literally where the body of Robin Hood is buried. There's been a lot of evidence to suggest that was his last resting place, but there's also been a lot of evidence to suggest that he lived in a completely different shire, old-fashioned wood, which is of course Shield Forest, Nottingham. You know the famous Nottingham Castle and the Sheriff of Nottingham, the subject of so many Hollywood films and all the rest of it. So I have to say to that question, I am unsure. One thing I am sure of, the grave is situated at the intersection of two ley lines.
Now, could you just explain what a ley line is exactly for the audience?
Yes, I only hesitated then because I didn't really want to get involved in a long discussion on ley lines. Some people don't understand them, and those that half understand them attribute to them properties which are a bit sort of new age and not really relevant. Ley lines are lines of energy that crisscross the Earth's surface. I believe they've been in existence for many, many decades, many centuries. I'm sure that our ancient ancestors were aware of the power of these lines, which later became known as ley lines. They built their churches, their early churches upon them, their early temples, their sacred trees they actually planted on the ley lines. Mostly these buildings or sites or temples were all built or planted in direct alignment to each other. Some have argued, like the late Alfred Watkins, that they were only used as trackways as a means. In those days, of course, they had to navigate vast distances across the UK. They had to,
before sat-navs and that sort of stuff like we've got today, they had to do it from stars and that sort of thing.
That's it, yeah. They had to transport, obviously not in cars, but in carts, essentials such as corn, crops after these have been reaped, to take them to different parts of the country, trade them with other communities, that sort of thing. But I think there's a much more deeper significance to the actual existence of these lines. Some may argue against me, indeed many have, many have, but I do think it's significant. I mentioned this at the beginning just to give you an idea of why I think it's significant. Robin Hood's grave, and I use the word grave in quotes at the moment, because as I said, I'm unsure if it's his actual grave, is situated directly on a pretty powerful ley line, and also where another one crosses it. Ley lines have also come to be associated with many sightings of unexplained phenomena.
So
apparitions,
ghosts,
ghosts of people, ghosts of objects, ghosts of animals even, or unexplained things that have happened along their course, such as audible sounds which cannot be explained, people screaming, people fighting in battle. I think they're just merely recordings And I think the images often seen along them, with the sites they're supposedly haunt, are no more than that, just images or reflections. But in some way, they're dependent on the existence of these lines, which contain an energy, not so much electric. This is a non-energy, if you like. In other words, it's not understood by science, and nor is it likely to be at the moment, this moment in time.
So this energy, is it negative or positive, to use a modern day term?
It can be both. That is either good or evil, or positive and negative. More often the case, the energy itself is completely neutral. Mm-hmm. It is only dependent on human intervention. For example, if people try and use it for a malign, malevolent purpose, mm-hmm. such as to injure other people, mm-hmm. or put curses on other people, or wish them ill will, or wish the crops to fail. It is human beings themselves, with the power of the human mind, that invoke the will, the energy, the evil energy. Mm-hmm. All ley lines do is just transmit this from one part to another.
Of sort of evil, shall we say, could actually use these. I believe are they called nodes? Is it called a node?
Yes,
is
that's one word for them.
Where the two they cross over one mm-hmm. another. So it's possible for certain individuals to gather at these nodes, and like a negative prayer, a bit like the Christians would like a positive prayer, that kind of thing.
Exactly. You couldn't put it better than I did. In fact, you probably put it a lot better. So, or to summarise your question briefly, yes, I believe Robin Hood's grave, the site of the grave rather, if it is this grave at all, but the area is definitely haunted, and quite a few ghostly figures there have been witnessed over the years by many, not just one or two, many independent local people.
Local people? These are local enthusiasts?
People living in the area, namely.
And of course, thanks to the famous authors such as like Anne Rice and Vampire Diaries, I know you're not going to like what I'm going to ask you next, because this isn't one of your favourite subjects.
Like it, because you've told me in advance now.
But perhaps thanks to all this publicity gathered, by all these authors of such books on vampires and that sort of phenomenon, there's been a renewed interest in vampires, and of course you're connected with the Highgate vampire, which we said earlier on.
Yes, I heard you.
Do you want to sort of expand on the Highgate vampire? Or?
Drew, not really. I thought this question was going to come up because I heard you say this in your introduction. And you pointed out that I don't like being described as a vampire hunter.
Yeah.
I prefer to be described as a psychic investigator, which I do. I have to be described as anything. I'm just someone that tries to look into the unexplained mysteries of life, mysteries of the afterlife, mysteries of religion, mysteries of magic. I don't like I can't really leave it there, can I? Because if I leave it there, people say, what's David Farron trying to hide?
Exactly what you're trying to cop out, yes, exactly. Okay. This is your chance to address the...
I certainly can't go into that Highgate vampire story. It's spread worldwide. Books have been written on it. Mm-hmm. I've written several books myself on the Highgate vampire. Not what it so much was, but what it was not. I've said in my books, I made it quite plain. I've made it plain in talks I've given, interviews I've given, television appearances, etc., 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 or people I just talk to in private, like yourself, that I do not believe and never have believed in blood-sucking vampires. Let's be clear about this. I'm talking about the sort of commercialised vampire that is seen to wander around at night after the hours of daylight, obviously. cannot cross running water, it cannot see its own reflection, or other people can't see its reflection in the mirror, and it goes around hypnotising young ladies, maybe by even entering their bedrooms at night. And I'm sorry, I know we've got to keep this clean. I wasn't having any intention of doing otherwise, but that is the Hollywood myth of the vampire. They're seduced, there are sexual implications, and the only way this, and it's been glamorised by Hollywood, obviously. In the olden days, first it was done in black and white, hence the old popularity of the Bela Lugosi film. Maybe it started, then Hollywood came along years later, decades later, and put the whole thing into glorious technicolor, where you could see the blood, you could see the fangs, you could see the women in the low cut. I'm sorry, I said keep this clean. I don't believe in vampires like that. And most important, this commercialised vampire can supposedly only be destroyed by being staked through the heart. Upon which, according to Hollywood, it's supposed to crumble to dust, and it turns back. It is no longer an undead being. It's supposed to turn into one of God's true dead. As one amateur vampire authority described it once. It's nonsense. They're neither if anything, they're just dead, but they're dead as human beings are when they die. There's no such thing as an undead being. It's nonsense. This is why I stress that I do not accept the existence of blood-sucking vampires. In the case of Highgate Cemetery, having said that, there was also an entity there. With this, there's a great similarity to what happened to Kirklees, because people tried to cash in the stories of this vampire. They turned a relatively harmless ghost, albeit malign, and tried to change it into a blood-sucking vampire, mainly for the purpose of publicity, mainly for the purpose of selling books, or mainly just for the purpose of simple egotism. A similar thing happened at Kirklees. It was nothing to do with the ghost there. It was nothing to do with the local figure and encounters that local people had had. Certain people made claims that the ghost was really a vampire, and the way that story started was because they were trying to commercialise the legend. It's all known by school kids today. The legend is anyway. That Robin Hood was bled to death by an evil prioress.
That's something I'd like to talk to you later on, if possible, about the prioress.
Sure.
Yeah. But so this would almost like a segue. It sort of joins together the Highgate vampire, your involvement basically in the Highgate vampire, in Robin Hood's grave, and of course your research, your personal research as well into the subject matter. So you have been involved for many years doing this kind of research, and I suppose you've yet to tell everybody else in the books that you've been writing. I know you've been writing quite a few books just recently and in the past. Maybe you should talk more about the research you've done in those books, maybe in future, because I think most people would say David Farron, Highgate Vampire, not Robin Hood, so you need to sort of perhaps get yourself more involved in that side of
things. They do, but that's hardly my fault, because the Highgate Vampire case got slightly out of hand. I won't go into all this, far too complex. I'm not evading anything. If you want to talk about Robin Hood and his grave, if I start talking about the Highgate Vampire, it got a bit out of hand and ended up with me serving a jail sentence in 1974. It was all connected, all put together. There were a group of Satanists then using Highgate Cemetery. I myself said yes, I'm in a serious group dedicated to Satanists. The British Psychic and Occult Society, which I'm president, found the remains of these ceremonies in some vaults in Highgate Cemetery. I've actually photographed them with other members of the society. I mean, I photographed the remains of these ceremonies, kept them for the files as evidence that this group were practicing. As I said, it all got out of hand, and the files were kept in my flat in Highgate. My flat in Highgate was raided by the police in early 1974. They found the photographs. There'd been a lot of serious desecration at Highgate Cemetery. And they assumed, the police assumed, that I had something to do with the desecration. As it happened, I didn't. I didn't even touch a grave there. I certainly didn't desecrate one. And that's why I said it started to get complicated, and I've only just touched on the beginning of it. And what were you asking me again?
I can see maybe this is something we could cover at a later date, sort of thing, perhaps. But trying to find a link with the Robin Hood and this vampire link, which is quite tenuous, so to speak, isn't it? I mean, it is based on alleged sightings, and the sighting I suppose we're talking about is the one from the 1970s.
That's the one in Highgate?
At Robin Hood's grave.
Oh, that, I understand. That story started later, I believe. It was 1990.
That was 90.
Some individual put forward a theory. Not a theory. He published an article in Uri Geller's magazine. I believe it was in 1990. I believe it was called Encounters. Maybe it was called The Unknown. I think it was Encounters. And he describes how he went up to visit the Robin Hood's grave in Yorkshire at Kirklees with 2 or 3 unnamed assistants. They went up by car apparently. They came across the old priory there, which is a few hundred yards from the old grave. This is the priory where Robin Hood was supposedly, at least according to some local enthusiasts, bled to death by the evil prioress. Hence the connection with the vampire.
The gatehouse.
The exsanguination of blood, draining of blood, and the story the theory was put forward that he'd been bitten by the evil prioress who was really herself a vampire. It's absolute nonsense. But this particular person cashed in on this sort of blood connection, if you like. Now, I'm not saying that particular story is untrue. That is the story of being bled to death. Because in those early times, that was a legitimate and acceptable form of medicine. They really believed that if they released some blood by cutting somebody's arm, usually quite a large amount of blood, it somehow would cure them. They believed that to have too much blood in the body was conducive to encouraging illness. Medical beliefs change over the years, obviously, and that was one of them, being bled to death. Bleeding to cure illnesses.
And of course, barbers actually offered that service a long time ago as well, which is the red and the white pole outside barbers today. So that practice is a kosher practice.
Oh, barbers?
Barbers, yes.
Yes, I thought you said something else then. Sorry, it's just my hearing. Yes, of course, that is one. That is another reason too. But but that's had the connection with the Kirklees vampire. Anyway, this came about because of this article. The person claimed he went up to the grave, I told you just now. They came across black magical symbols in the old gatehouse where Robin Hood, they said, was bled to death. They went on to the grave, but just before they got to it, they found a dead goat that had its throat cut, been completely drained of blood. and they said that that put together with the black magical symbols found in the old gatehouse, which incidentally is not as old as it's been made out to be. It's only dates from the 15th century.
So this isn't the actual
No, I don't know.
gatehouse that Robin's supposed to have shot the arrows sort of.
Well, local people like to think it is, but it most certainly is not. Because they'd like to admit it or not, it is not. And any architectural investigation could scientifically establish this, could prove it, if they really wanted to. The bloodless goat, the signs in the black magical signs in the old gatehouse, as I just said, not so old. And other things, when they said they approached the grave, Robin Hood's grave, they found distinct finger marks in the soil around the edges, and they weren't mouse holes. The person claimed that this was an escape route for the vampire to dematerialise into mist or smoke or ectoplasm, whatever, and then when it came out through these holes, it would rematerialise as the vampire.
So it was like a passageway to the other world.
Yes,
kind of thing.
that was the thing. All this thing. I'm sorry, I might be telling you this, but it's not because I believe one word of it, but I'm just saying what this person claimed and how he added to this vampire legend. And he added to it even further, because in the article this person says, and let's bear in mind please, he wrote it. He wrote it, not myself. He said that the three of them, keeping a vigil at the grave, nothing much happened until about 2 hours later. There they were in the middle of the woods, almost completely lost, apart from they reached the grave. And they suddenly heard a terrible shrieking, wailing, and they looked up and they saw it made their blood run cold, were their description. And one of the assistants was so petrified, he ran off blindly, wildly in the night. Of course it's very overgrown there, especially with bramble bushes, and this person tripped and fell headlong into a bramble bush, and he was pretty badly cut. The other two found him and they fled. They got him back to the car and they headed back for London. Interesting point here. These people claim to be psychic investigators. They went to the old gatehouse, saw the black magical signs, didn't even take a picture of them.
And these black magical signs, what did they actually look like?
Well, I've actually seen, because I actually visited Robin Hood's grave myself in 2005. That's another story that was to come later. I examined the marks firsthand, a couple of other people, and it seemed they were just stone masons' marks.
This is like the pie symbol.
Yes, rather like they used to put them on stones in churches. It was an emblem, it was a signature of their trade. That's all they were. They weren't black magical symbols at all. Anyway, they never even photographed them, which was extremely amateurish. I think to go on a psychic investigation, you had even a camera to keep record of it. And surprise, when they found the bloodless goat, they didn't even take a photograph of that either, as any sort of evidence. And you know something else? They didn't even take a photograph of Robin Hood's grave. They were there. The first thing you do is to photograph a site, a location, from different angles, so you've got photograph later for reference, and for the file. They didn't even do that. It only begs the question, why not? And I have said in the past, and I'm saying again to you tonight, the reason was because the whole thing's made up fiction, believed only by a few gullible people who might even give them the benefit of the doubt, who want to sort of exploit the Robin Hood legend for their own ends. And I'm talking about local groups in Kirklees.
In the surrounding area around where the grave is?
The surrounding area where the grave is.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, well, we seem to have left Highgate now, so I'm pleased about that anyway.
That's fine. There's been a lot of material, obviously, over the years. Has been written. I mean, you've written your own material and your own research and papers on the subject.
Yeah.
But also, there's some great authors around in Yorkshire who've written many books on the subject. And there has been one just recently, I believe, was Kai Roberts.
His name was Kai Roberts.
Kai Roberts.
Yes,
and he sets the record straight, I believe. And
he really has done very, very serious research into the whole Robin Hood legend. Kai Roberts contacted me and he said he'd like to give me a list of written questions.
Mm-hmm.
As I was later to become patron of the Yorkshire Robin Hood Society. I became patron of that by invitation in 2003. I believe it was February.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't the actual secretary, but I was the patron.
Yeah.
And I had to do most of the serious work.
Right.
Well, that's a well-known fact. And Kai Roberts had heard about this and he wanted to send me, he told me about his proposed book. Questions arrived about 18 months before it was published. Just Christmas last gone. Just before Christmas. And he wanted also to ask a colleague of mine, Gareth Medway, some questions too, because I visited, again, this may become later, I visited the grave with Gareth Medway in 2005. The purpose of the visit was to observe, if not perform, a blessing ceremony at the grave, because it was reputedly haunted by a pretty malignant figure which had been seen by locals over the years. It got into the press, in the local press. He found this in the course of his research. He then contacted other people in the area.
You were beaten to the post, were you not, by Father Flack in the 1970s?
Yes, I think we should add that Father Flack was he an Anglican priest?
I believe he was.
I think he was. He wasn't Roman Catholic. Well, not that it makes any difference. I was in contact with Lady Armytage after I became patron. I told her that I didn't believe in the stories of the vampire there. She'd seen this ridiculous 1990 article in the New York magazine that had been posted to her. She thought it was a load of nonsense. I was in contact with her through her manager David Hepworth, who lived on the Armytage estate. And we had long telephone conversations here. It was under an hour long. He was very concerned because he'd heard about certain societies in the area. Actually, his feeling was, I don't wish to malign anyone, his concern or his suspicions were that in legend, in fact in history in Hollywood, Robin Hood has always been associated with Nottingham. And David Hepworth had the feeling that, and I'm sorry if I'm misquoting him, but I'm sure he'd confirm it, these certain people in Yorkshire were trying to take the tourist industry away from Nottingham, and of course this upset the tourist councils, the people at Nottingham.
Trying to divert them to Yorkshire, basically. And
exactly,
wouldn't do, yeah.
That's what he was concerned about.
Okay.
And my concern as patron, and I made my views known, they're no secret, while I've never disputed the fact that there was some supernatural presence, possibly malign, which haunted the area around the grave, I always left it 50-50, or a big question mark over it, to the people that were saying Robin Hood is buried beneath it. I always said, what is the proof of that? And local interest in the grave seemed to be united, there were quite a few groups and people who were trying to, if you like, get it so the grave was more accessible.
To the public?
Well, yes.
Yeah,
In other words, public access.
Yeah.
But the only problem there was, of course, Lady Armytage, who would refuse people permission to visit the grave, unless on occasion she would grant special permission to certain people. I believe one of them was the Tony Robinson from the BBC crew.
Right.
She actually gave him permission to film at the grave, and the film was shown on the BBC. That she was very much opposed to smaller groups, rather, can I say, groups that weren't really officially recognised.
Okay.
That's where a lot of the conflict came in. Anyway, I digress. As patron, as I said, I was invited to patron in 2003. I actually took an interest in the case, and part of my interest was to try and, if you like, get Lady Armytage on side, not by sort of bullying methods, not by trying to threaten her with trespassing to the grave at night if she wouldn't give permission, which a lot of people did. Now, and coming back to your question, I was one of them.
Right.
I don't deny it. Lady Armytage did take my theories, I should say the late Lady Armytage, because she passed away a couple of years ago. I was very interested in my theories about ley lines, that we didn't accept that the ghost scene there was a blood-sucking vampire.
And she'd be quite relieved to have, for you to have said that as well, I would have.
Yes, I'm glad though, because in retrospect, and I believe Kai put this in his book, which reminded me about it. In retrospect, Lady Armytage actually commissioned some people, I'm not quite sure who, maybe Kai Roberts knows, to research into the possibility that the grave situated in her grounds on the estate were on ley lines. That was commissioned by Lady Armytage. In fact, I've got a copy of the book here. Would you like to see it?
Yes, please, yes.
Oh, Della, would you mind getting me the Kai Roberts book up on the shelf there, please? It's got a green cover and it's called...
Grave Concerns.
That's the one, darling. Thank you. Well, Kai writes in his book, David Hepworth, and let's remember this is Kai Roberts writing this, and David Hepworth is I think he's still manager of the estate, I'm not quite sure, but he was Lady Armytage's manager. Kai writes, David Hepworth claims that Lady Armytage had actually commissioned a ley line study in the late 1990s. He does not specify exactly what evidence this study examines, but he recalls and confirmed that a ley line runs through the ironworks on Castle Hill, Kirklees, which would have passed through the chancel of the Priory Church. Hepworth even suggests it is significant that Robin Hood's grave lies on the same plane as the earthworks. And what he's trying to say is that he's named a couple more locations along the main ley line, which I believe goes from the Harwell Well,
Alliger Well,
which is now built over just in front of the garage, which I actually examined when I was up there.
This is the one in Brick House, isn't it?
Yes.
Near the gravesite.
It then goes straight through the site of Robin Hood's grave, and it aligns with Heartshead Church, about a quarter of a mile away, I'm guessing, about a quarter of a mile, and it then goes on to Castle Hill.
This is Castle Hill in Kirklees, Huddersfield,
which I've also visited. The whole point is that it's more or less confirmed that Lady Armytage herself commissioned some experts to verify the existence of ley lines on her property. So yes, Kai's book was taken quite seriously.
Right. So Lady Armytage herself was trying to sort of pick up on the research. It's almost as if she wanted to find out for herself, and obviously she didn't complete this, what we would term as a great work of Lady Armytage, because she died, obviously.
Well, I'd like to think she did. Well, the evidence actually suggests that she did just that.
Which flies in the face of all the other reports of Lady Armytage being dead against anything to do with ley lines, with magic, as such. It's almost seen as if she's dead against anything to do with the grave, and she'd rather it just disappear out the window, more or less.
Well, that's what she was accused of by a few local groups.
So Lady Armytage, as you say, from all the reports, she'd rather it sort of be brushed under the carpet. But we've now got evidence, and in Kai Roberts' book,
Yes,
basically says the opposite.
it does say the opposite. What she was opposed to, Lady Armytage, were people trespassing on her land without permission, and also adamantly opposed to these vampire stories, because that made people trespass on her land even more. As I said, I believe I mentioned I visited Kirklees in 2005, April I think it was, and we stayed in a house in the area, and we went around quite a few local sites. I believe as far away as Pendle Hill, and also Wycoller Abbey, all places which were reputedly haunted. Of course, Heartshead Church, Castle Hill. We looked at the well. You couldn't actually see it, as I said, it was built over. And of course the grave itself. We actually spent a vigil at the grave one night in one weekday night, and performed a ceremony there.
A ceremony as in what, a religious
Not as
ceremony?
in black magic.
No.
I hasten to add. No. Yes, it was in fact a sort of a religious ceremony. It wasn't an exorcism ceremony. It was a blessing ceremony.
So we've already spoken about Father Vac earlier on, who tried to do this, but of course he was unsuccessful because of the mass publicity and hysteria surrounding him.
He was refused
being there.
permission.
Right, but
right.
you actually got you tried to get permission, of course, because you've been on side with Lady Armytage. So you've gone through all the right moves to get permission to go.
Yes, that's right.
But you actually were, I believe, successful in your attempts, and perhaps you could explain a bit more about that.
You mean to actually visit the grave? Well, we didn't have direct permission, but we didn't have a direct refusal. One of the people with us, who went to when we held the vigil, it was Gareth and myself and 2 or 3 other people. One of these people actually had permission. He had a letter from Lady Armytage, given her, she was a young lady, personal permission to visit Robin Hood's grave. From Lady Armytage herself, signed.
Was it signed permission to go and visit the grave whenever one wants?
Permission was given to her. It wasn't given to the rest of us. I'm trying to be actually factual here. But on the other hand, she wanted to go to the grave at dusk, and she actually told the other people that they couldn't expect a young lady to go off walking through the desolate woods at night. and so we accompanied her.
Okay,
That's what she told everybody present, yeah.
Mm.
We knew technically it was trespassing, but I remember I was the patron of the Yorkshire Robin Hood Society. I'd already been in correspondence with Lady Armytage to explain we didn't believe all the nonsense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'd already had long conversations with their manager, David Hepworth, who I just quoted to in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And so we didn't feel they were just complete strangers who'd been refused permission.
They were just turning up on the night, sort
No,
of thing.
nothing like it.
No.
We went to the grave to conduct form a proposed ritual, which was to clear the area of any malignant forces. Didn't cause any damage there, Drew, I assure you of that. I mean, the people going up there after the pubs closed had a few drinks too many. They were the people who were causing damage, if anything, by leaving empty beer cans up there. Sitting around the grave drinking. Yeah, to those sort of people, it was just a big laugh. It wasn't serious.
Mm-hmm.
And they were leaving rubbish behind. We actually had to clear the front of the grave of leaves, bits of broken glass and everything, because we had to lay on the grave some magical implements which we'd taken with us to assist us in performing this blessing ceremony. So if anything, the ceremony was, we arrived at the grave just before nightfall. But it was still light, it was April. We must have got there about 6:30 in the evening, 7 o'clock. We prepared the ceremony, implements for the ceremony, laid them out. The actual ceremony itself took over an hour and a half. Then of course we had to clear up behind us, gather everything up. And we took some photographs there for the record. And we probably left the grave in a better state than we found it, ironically speaking. The whole point I'm making to you is we didn't cause any damage there. But you're right in saying technically we didn't have permission, but we weren't refused permission to go either.
And of course, when we were talking about a blessing and an exorcism, they are very sort of similar. Like if Father Flag had been successful, would probably like to have thought that you might not have had to have gone to such lengths as to what you that you did in 2005.
But
what difference would the ritual be? Because I know there's a lot of sort of secrecy surrounding the magical rituals that I suppose we're talking about here.
Yeah, there's lots of secrecy with good reason,
and which we'd like to talk about later on if possible.
but I could touch on it. I mean, I'm not allowed to say too much about the actual incantations that take place during a ceremony. It's not so much as anything highly secretive about it. There's no words that can blast people or perform miracles or make things happen. But there are certain magical incantations and certain magical words we believe are words that contain power. But only symbolic power perhaps, but they've got to be said correctly and on the right occasion and under the right circumstances. The main reason for secrecy is because if they were made public, they'd be abused. Just like the word vampire's been abused. And people will go around using these words without knowing what they meant, and they could open themselves to actual serious danger. Well, psychic danger. They could invite forces outside of them to actually come in. They wouldn't be prepared to know how to repel them. And that's the only reason for secrecy. It's not to cover anything up.
There's no conspiracy sort of things around it exactly. Obviously the magic and the rituals that you're performing are so powerful that they get rid of the despicable demonic forces that are said to have been at that grave. So would you say that your ritual is stronger than what Father Flack would have done himself?
It probably would have been, but again I stress we did not actually perform an exorcism ceremony. We performed a blessing ceremony. There was a good reason for this. The only evidence I actually spoke to people, I meant to say this before, 2 local witnesses. We met them in the Three Nuns pub, which is not far from the grave, a very old coaching inn. And other witnesses we met in Halifax and at the person's house in whom we stayed. And we didn't perform an exorcism as such. After all, the only possible evidence we had to support an exorcism were just stories of a vampire, a wailing hag, and a sacrificed goat, and unfounded rumours of Satanism. That's just not enough, that's just not sufficient. While there have been, admittedly, many local reports of a ghostly figure seen in and around the grave, that is a completely different matter.
But is this the one that's said to have floated above the ground? Is that the one you're referring to? In the 1970s, I believe it was.
Yes, there were reports. One of them, I believe, went back to the 1970s. And the same person had another encounter with this apparition a decade later. I spoke to this person in person. He had never said it was a vampire. These were words attributed to him. The people that went to the grave, that claimed they went to the grave, claimed it was a vampire. When they heard of his account, they were the people that attributed him seeing a vampire, but it wasn't a vampire at all. So, in other words, you don't perform an exorcism just on the basis of local ghost stories, albeit if some of the people are completely genuine. His account, I know, I spoke to him in person, was genuine. But exorcism, in reality, is only used as a very last resort. In genuine cases, that is where people really, really believe, or in fact, some would argue, could in fact be possessed, or something's happening to them. In their homes, they're attacked, psychically attacked, by some demonic force or things of that nature. But as I said, the ceremony we performed was only a blessing ceremony. That's all. Oh, incidentally, as I mentioned Gareth J. Medway before, he was in fact the person that actually conducted the blessing ceremony at Robin Hood's grave in April 2005.
So he was there at the side of you when you performed it together, basically, alongside with the other enthusiasts who gathered as witnesses.
That is true, yes.
So it would be nice if we could speak to Gareth to get his account of what happened on that night, and I believe that Red Monkey, the film company, were filming at the same time as well. So maybe he might have an interesting story about that.
Well, yes, I'm sure he'd be willing to talk to you, especially if he knows it's got my approval. I'm sure Red Monkey would be willing to talk to you too. All that happened there was that Red Monkey was a film crew who heard about our intentions to visit the grave. I'm not quite sure how they heard about it, but it was leaked by local sources.
Local enthusiasts again.
And they approached me and they learned we were going to the grave. I said, but we're covered with permission. They said, can they come along and film it? And we agreed, and we met at the grave and they did film it. As I said to you, it's very possible that Gareth, well, he's the best one to tell you what happened.
Right. Yeah, I would be interested to sort of talk to him, definitely.
Well, he will be here tomorrow night. If you can visit again.
Yeah, I mean, if you will allow us to come again, we would love to talk to Gareth. Yes, yeah. I suppose we've got further questions we could ask you as well. So.
Well, you'd be more than welcome.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that. Yeah. Well, join us next time when we'll be hopefully talking to Gareth and we'll get his point of view on what happened at the grave on the night of the blessing. Thanks for joining us. Good night. host tonight is Gareth. Welcome to the studio, Gareth. So Gareth, you're not one for the limelight. Indeed, you tend to keep out of nearly all the publicity. So we're really grateful that you chose to accept our invitation to come to the studio tonight. Now, tell us what happened on that fateful night of the ceremony.
Well, first thing to do is what is called smudge people, which ideally ought to be done with burning sage. You waft it over people. Unfortunately, I didn't have any burning sage, so I used insects, but I did it on everybody, including David, members of the Yorkshire Robin Hood Society, and Red Monkey, the camera crew, were there. One of whom actually sort of filmed me wafting incense over them. Then, ideally you ought to spend all day over something like this, but that wasn't practicable. So the key things were invoking the goddess Athena, who traditionally was a destroyer of demons, by using the ancient Greek hymn to her. Then the hymn to Hecate, who is the goddess who took souls away, the dead away into the light. So when souls are trapped, then she takes them away. Then the goddess Themis to bring harmony into there. However, I started stumbling over the words, and there was sort of cold feeling. It was like there was a strong resistance to what I was doing.
A bit like what people get when they sort of see ghosts and that sort of thing. The air goes sort of cold and that sort of thing.
Yes, but I was sort of unable to think what I was saying, and then I got to the hymn Themis, which is something I recite every morning, and I couldn't remember the words. Well, not the Greek words, which, I mean, it begins Antitled Chapter, but I just couldn't remember it, even though it's something I recite every day. I eventually remembered the English words. Illustrious Themis of celestial birth, thee I invoke, young blossom of the earth. So there was obviously strong resistance. Then what I did was I took a sort of wand, a crystal tip wand that was bought for me in the Himalayas, which is used for banishing bad energies, spirits, whatever, and went around with it, like banishing everything. Mind you, the cameraman kept following me around.
So that kind of put you off, did it?
Well, it didn't put me off, but I felt like I was banishing the cameraman.
Right.
So that was the essence of it. And people have asked me, did I think it worked? Now, it's very difficult to tell. I've been involved with exorcism of haunted houses, and several times it's happened that people said, oh, the house is totally different now. However, with something like a grave, people have seen things there, but it's not something where people go regularly, so you can't get that sort of immediate feedback. A man called Roger Williams, who's a rock bassist, said that he'd been up there twice in the 60s, and both times he'd seen this mysterious woman in white who totally terrified him. And he said that she didn't seem to walk, she seemed to glide over the place, and since it was autumn, both times it was autumn and a lot of leaves on the ground, but she didn't make any noise.
So she was floating above the ground?
Floating above the ground.
Right, okay.
And she glared at him. He actually said to me, it's an evil place. All of your crucifixes won't help you. I refrain from saying to you, we don't have crucifixes, we use crystals. But certainly there have been reports like that of some really nasty things there. So I hope it got rid of them. I can't really say it worked, and I haven't been back there since, so I can't really say. I just hope it worked.
Somebody was supposed to have had an asthma attack there, and I just wondered whether the spirit of that deceased person or that vampire may have stretched that far. I don't know anything about these things, so...
Well, a ghost can give you a kind of panic attack, which might be an asthma attack, so that's perfectly possible, yes.
So we're just hoping that the ceremony that you did has actually banished this so-called vampiric sort of spirit of some kind, sort of thing.
I mean, this story about little holes, I think that occurs in Montague Summers, who was quite an assiduous researcher, but he was quite mad. Montague Summers thought that the graves of vampires had little holes in them through which the vampire came out, but that's ridiculous. Even supposing that somehow a dead body could come back to life, it couldn't get out through a little hole. What I think is, possibly in past ages, well, I do believe in ghosts. Sometimes a ghost can look completely solid. I think maybe in the past people saw what seemed to be the solid body of a dead person and thought that the person had really risen out of their graves. I don't think so. I think actually it was just the spirit of them. So there might have been something like that, but nobody though seems to have claimed to have seen the spirit of Robin Hood. It seems to be a woman in white and a man in black. The woman in white conceivably might have been the evil prioress who was supposed to have bled Robin Hood to death.
Is this the one Elizabeth de Staton, the one that Lady Armytage got?
Yes, exactly.
Yes, she's got, for some reason she's got the gravestone in her back garden. I don't know if there's any connection there or not, but that's the same one you're talking about.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it might have been her. Mm. Just one of the things, it's said in a slow manuscript that Robin Hood was buried near to the King's Highway. Near is obviously a relative term. It isn't actually that far from the King's Highway. So, and the slow manuscript was one of the very earliest records of Robin Hood written sort of in the Elizabethan period. So, and given that it seems that it is only about 200 years old, did replace a grave slab which was definitely medieval design and which clearly had the name Robin Hood engraved upon it. It might be the grave of Robin Hood. You couldn't prove that, even if you dug it up though, of course, and you found some DNA, no one would know what the DNA of Robin Hood would look like, so it can never be proven.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for coming tonight, and thank you, Gareth. Is there anything else? Yeah, just to summarise on matters that pertaining to the grave itself. You've said you may not agree the grave is Robin Hood's final resting place.
Yes, I do.
Therefore, what valid role do you think the grave plays for the local people who've obviously grown up with the grave being a site of such historical interest, you know, within their own community? How do you think that they feel, and what?
Well, I have the greatest sympathy for people like that. I mean, the site is certainly of an historical interest. There's no question about that. Mm-hmm. Whether or not Robin Hood's physical remains are actually buried at a precise spot, whether he's buried in Sherwood Forest, it doesn't really make any difference. Mm-hmm. I appreciate the feelings of local people. Forget the vampire stories, forget the wailing hags, forget the sacrifice goats. I don't think even the local people believe that yarn. But they do believe, they realise, they appreciate that the site is very old, mm-hmm. and they want to preserve its memory. Or rather, they want to preserve it intact. I understand at the moment there's some scheme by the local council up in Kirklees to build multi-office blocks or something like that, or a complex of houses, of council houses or something, which virtually go up to the grave itself. I think that would be a disaster for the local area. I'm completely against it. I'm completely in sympathy with the feelings of the local people. I'm talking about the genuine ones,
yeah.
The genuine local inhabitants. Mm-hmm. And I think that the grave should definitely be preserved for its historical value alone.
Well, thank you very much for clarifying that, because that is a very important point that you make there, and it's good to clarify that to the people in Cyberland who can obviously see that you have a genuine interest in the actual site itself as being a site of local interest and nothing else really. So that's a very big
Well, thank you for saying that. I always have had an interest in the site, and when I was patron of the Yorkshire Robin Hood Society, I did everything that I could possibly do to put those views forward.
Well, thank you very much, David. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.